Okay, so last time when we left off, we had just finished up the establishment of the Third Republic, and you could kind of see right before the Third Republic that we went into this phase in France between monarchical republic, what we would call a constitutional republic, much like what Great Britain has, to an extreme, very radical form of socialism, your proto-socialism, however you want to describe it. But anyway, there's this big tear where the common classes are pretty much upset with the monarchical classes. And that trend is going to continue here as we continue talking about France prior to World War I. So in 1895, during this Third Republic, the Dreyfus affair happened and it threatened the Third Republic. Alfred Dreyfus was a Jewish captain in the French general staff, and he was found guilty of selling military secrets. Now, the very conservative branch of this kind of Republican constitutional government was still very much about ranks in society and the power of the church. And so Dreyfus is a commoner who makes military rank. He is also not Catholic, which is, the major religion in France. And so he presents someone that, see, you can't trust the lower classes because, and non-Catholics, because they have no honor, they have no tradition, no allegiance to the state. It's not quite that they were monarchists as much as they still believed in the power of the state and the regimented authoritarian structure of the state, whereas the proto-socialists of France really believed in the dismemberment of the state, that the state was tyranny. So after he began serving a sentence of life in prison, evidence of his innocence was found. Now, this new evidence pointed to a wealthy Catholic officer as the true traitor. Well, now here's a guy who is a paradigm of the state. He's wealthy for one. He's an officer, family tradition of officers in his family. So he represents the state, and he's Catholic. I can't say devout Catholic if he's lying and selling secrets and lets someone else be punished for it, but he passes himself off as Catholic. But since the army was predominantly Catholic and aristocratic, the new suspect was not brought to trial, and Dreyfus was left out to hang. So after a wave of political outrage, the Third Republic ordered a new trial. The commoners, Catholic, non-Catholic, were very much behind Dreyfus because they saw him as symbolic of the people and the state's tyranny of the people. So while the trial did not overturn Dreyfus's guilty verdict, the government offered him a pardon in 1899 and a full exoneration in 1906, but that didn't stop the social upheaval in France, again, that's been going on since the French Revolution, of the common classes versus the state. So this incident was also an indication of anti-Semitism, or discrimination or hatred of Jews, that was rampant in Europe at the time. Dreyfus wasn't supported, not necessarily because he was Jew. Matter of fact, they probably lost him more support. If he had been a Protestant, he probably would have had more support. But the fact that he was Jewish allowed a lot of people to point out, he's a Jew. And this is just symbolic of the hatred of Jews, what we call anti-Semitism, that had been going on since the Roman Empire became Christian, basically, this, persecution of Jews. And it's still, rampant in Europe at this time and very much identifiable. It also fundamentally changed the National Assembly to placing control in the hands of the radical Republicans. And don't use the terms that we use today for Republican. We're not talking, the radical Republicans were different than the conservative Republicans. The conservative Republicans were very statist. They still wanted a republic, but they were very statist and authoritarian and traditional. Whereas the radical Republicans, much more socialist, much more, wanting to free people up. So it placed more control in the hands of the radical Republicans as the people began to vote for them more, recognizing this tension between the classes. And the radical Republicans wanted to usher in a much more democratic society. According to them, this could only be accomplished by destroying the influence of the aristocracy and the Catholic Church. The high-ranking officials who held anti-government views were ousted from the army, and Catholic religious orders like the Jesuits, the Franciscans, the Dominicans were expelled from France. In 1905, the French government recognized the separation of church and state to prevent the influence of the Catholic Church. So that's what's going on in France, and you see it's pretty tempestuous, but it's all internal. It's not, looking at outward war. And so we can still say there was a calm before the storm in general in Europe. But where you can really see this calm is across the channel in Great Britain, where Queen Victoria rules. And she has ruled in England from 1837 to her death in 1901, the second longest reigning monarch now. She was actually only 18 years old when she was crowned queen, and her reign is now the second longest in history because Queen Elizabeth II, her great-great-granddaughter, has now ruled longer than her, surpassing her in 2015. But this was not the only unique fact about her. For starters, her reign was so long and prosperous, it is also called the Victorian Age. And for such a prominent, imposing leader, she was physically very small. She stood a mere 5 feet tall, and you know how short I am. She's a lot smaller than me. So you might also be surprised to learn that she survived 7 attempts on her life. She was a very bold, brave woman for the little bitty thing that she was. One of my favorite quotes, she was just a very stoic, very somber person. And so one of her courtiers once tried to lighten things up with a joke and looked at her, and she just sat there staring at him for a couple seconds and then said, "We are not amused." I love that. I use that line actually every now and then just to see how people react. But most of these failed assassinations on her involved these attempts at shooting the queen as she rode in her carriage. Amazingly, each time the queen survived, her public popularity rose greatly. Victoria was the first recorded carrier also of the disease hemophilia, a disorder where blood does not clot properly, and therefore if you get even the smallest cut, you just continue to bleed. It never forms a scab to stop that. So because so many of her royal descendants were afflicted with the disorder, it was also called the royal disease. And she had lots of royal descendants she had to marry off. The Tsar Nicholas II was her grandson. Kaiser Wilhelm II was her grandson. And of course, her grandson was the King of England during World War I. It's almost like a cousin's war during World War I. So while the period might be named after the queen, the power of the monarch actually declined during this period in favor of a constitutional monarchy, or a monarchical republic, so to say, where the monarch really doesn't have a lot of power. They are a figurehead. They represent the moral authority of the state, but the real power of the state to declare war, to decide budgets, to make matters of everyday importance belongs to the legislature in England. It means that the powers of the monarch are restricted by a constitution, and not a written constitution like the United States, but a constitution based on traditional, laws of the past, edicts of past kings, the Magna Carta, the Glorious Revolution, the Petition of Right, things like that. So a series of legislation also moved most political power into the hands of the voters and those they elected. The Reform Act of 1867 lowered the economic requirements for voting and greatly expanded the number of men who were qualified to vote. Prior to this time, only men who owned a certain amount of property were actually allowed to vote. And I don't know if you like British comedies, like we watched a little bit earlier in the course of Monty Python, but there's also a great one called Blackadder, and there's 4 different seasons of it that focus on different historical periods. And I believe the 3rd season focuses on this period right here. And an aristocrat decides he's going to run for parliament, and it turns out that in the area of voters, only 2 people are actually registered voters. So it goes through the whole episode like it's this big political drama like today, where he has to convince a lot of voters, and then at the end they announce results, and both votes have come back for. And so it's kind of funny because all those economic requirements severely restricted who could vote, and in his district there actually was only 2 people who were actually eligible. So it's kind of hilarious. So this is an important step for working men to change this. They were gradually gaining more political power and say in their government. Now, women were still not considered eligible for the right to vote. But in 1872, the secret ballot made it unlikely that anyone could bribe or force voters to support a candidate as well. Now, during Victoria's rule, the British expanded their colonial empire to places such as Africa, the Middle East, and India. And this caused some lasting effects that we still see today. For instance, since the English set up colonies in these areas, the English language was used by local people. And so English today has kind of become the lingua franca, or French used to be a very widespread language. The language used by everybody in commerce and trade today is English as a result of this. Trade also increased between Europe and these countries. And poor treatment of the colonized also led to long-lasting feelings of resentment. From 1870 to 1871, one of the more important events happened, and that was the Franco-Prussian War. And this brought in, remember, we unified Germany into a sort of constitutional monarchical republic, very similar to Great Britain, except the Kaiser had much more power, particularly over foreign affairs. In the Franco-Prussian War, the French and the Germans were fighting basically over industrialization. There is a valley that lies between France and Germany, basically proper, called Alsace-Lorraine. And it is a valley rich in natural resources, particularly coal, which was important for running factories and industrialization. Germany saw its industrialization as a way to unite and become very powerful, and indeed they were. But without the Alsace-Lorraine, they couldn't adequately get the resources. Colonization was not happening fast enough to get these resources. They needed these. And so fights between them and France took place over it. There were German speakers living there. There were French speakers living there to this day. And so people would claim I'm German, people would claim I'm French, and that gave them reasons enough to go to war over to say, this is ours, not yours. Well, in this war, the Germans won. And the Prussians won. I'm jumping ahead because I've already told you that Germany unifies here. When I'm saying Germany here, I'm talking about Prussia. The Franco-Prussian War is between Prussia and France over all the same things. The French were defeated by the Prussians and forced to pay a large indemnity and give up several provinces, including Alsace and Lorraine. Immediately after the French signed the treaty, all the Germans are there in the Palace of Versailles. The treaty is called the Treaty of Versailles. They all decide, let's become one country, and they elect the King of Prussia to be the Kaiser or Emperor. So that the Second German Reich was ushered in on January 18th, 1871, with the crowning of Wilhelm I as Kaiser, the German word for Caesar. So this event truly shifted the balance of power in Europe by creating a strong, organized German state. And despite a new authoritarian or dictatorial government, even though it was democratic, the empire had some democratic features that defined it as that as well. One such feature was the Reichstag, or German parliament, with elected representatives. And the Reichstag had the power to amend or accept or reject legislation proposed by the Kaiser. The Bundesrat, or Federal Council of State Deputies, also had a hand in legislation. Otto von Bismarck became chancellor, and basically he only answered to the emperor. So this is a very executive-centric government. His powers included initiating legislation in virtually all matters of the state. And he spent a great deal of time and effort promoting national unity and a sense of pride. Wilhelm I passed away in 1888, and his son Friedrich III assumed the title of emperor. He lived only 99 days into his rule, and the title was then passed on to Wilhelm II, the son of Friedrich III. And because of this quick transition, this time is sometimes nicknamed the Year of the Three Emperors. So the new emperor forced Bismarck out of his position in March 1890. Now, admittedly, Bismarck's an old man. He's in his 80s by this time. Wilhelm II is a young, vibrant guy. He wants young, vibrant guys around him. And so he felt Bismarck had accumulated way too much power and the emperor should have more power. And so he kind of forces Bismarck out. In 1912, the Social Democratic Party gained a majority in the Reichstag, and the Second German Reich ended with Germany's defeat in World War I, which officially ended with the Versailles Treaty of 1919, the abdication of Wilhelm II, and the end of the rule of the Kaiser in Germany. But we'll get to all that. So that's what's happening in the three major states of that time period: England, France, and Germany. But what's happening in the world overall is driven in large part by advances in science, particularly during the 19th century, which changed the way people viewed the world. In 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, what we just usually call the origin of species. In his book, he presented his idea of natural selection. In other words, he believed that plants and animals evolved over time through organic evolution. According to this theory, animals produced more offspring than could survive. And the offspring that survived did so because they possessed traits that gave them the best chance for survival. This is an idea he actually got from Thomas Malthus and reading him. So we can understand this better by picturing two birds. One bird has bright yellow feathers that make it clearly visible, while the other has brown feathers that easily blend in with tree bark. Which bird will be more likely to be found by predators? It'd probably be the yellow one. So according to Darwin, the desirable trait of the brown feathers would continue to be produced because that bird survived to have offspring. And this idea is also known as survival of the fittest. Unfortunately, this idea would later expand into a science called eugenics that would differentiate humans by race and claim that white Europeans were the fittest for survival due to their advanced technologies and civilization, and serve as the justification for the white man's burden, the colonization of non-white, non-European peoples later. So Darwin applied his theory to humans in his 1871 publication, The Descent of Man. And his ideas were extremely controversial at the time because they made humans ordinary products of nature rather than special beings created in God's image. His work was eventually accepted by the scientific community. In another important breakthrough, scientists Pierre and Marie Curie discovered that the element radium emitted radiation from within the atom itself in 1898. According to this research, then, atoms were not simply hard material, but microscopic worlds containing subatomic particles that could be released. I'm sure you've all heard of Albert Einstein. Well, this is the era where he comes to prominence. And he's been considered one of the great scientific minds of the 20th century. However, many may have heard a popular story that he failed in high school. In fact, he's actually an excellent student throughout his high school career. So for those of you who are lazy enough to not be doing anything, slacking off on grades, who think Einstein failed and he got through, that's a myth, really. He was actually far ahead of other students, particularly in the field of mathematics. So where did this idea come from that he failed in high school? Well, in 1895, Einstein took an entrance exam for the Federal Polytechnic School in Switzerland, which is kind of a college preparatory advanced high school. At just 16 years old, he was 2 years younger than other applicants. He excelled in the physics and math portions, but he failed the subjects that were not related to science. In 1905, he published the Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies, which contained his theory of relativity, one of his more famous theorems. And according to this theory, space and time are not absolute, but depend on the perception of the observer. And this is fascinating stuff in physics to me. I love the theory of relativity because basically it says our perceptions, particularly sight, are dependent on what we can see that light is hitting. We see much better in the day than at night. And therefore, if something is going faster than the speed of light, we can't observe it because light has no chance to hit it. And therefore, our perception of anything beyond the speed of light would mean that time and space would have to bend inwards, allowing us to see it. In other words, to slow it down almost. So if we were in a car going down a street faster than the speed of light, and we're looking, and let's say it's a city street, there's skyscrapers and buildings on either side of us. Well, as we're going, what we would notice is those skyscrapers and buildings would start to curve inward and towards us so that we could perceive them at the speed of light. In other words, according to our perception, time is held to the speed of light. We cannot break the speed of light. Otherwise, we just wouldn't know it. We wouldn't be able to perceive it, and there'd be no way to account for it later. So in other words, space and time do not exist without the human ability to observe them. Fascinating stuff to me. He also stated that matter was simply another form of energy, and his formula for this was E equals mc squared. I'm sure you've all heard that energy is equal to mass times the speed of light squared. Importantly, this formula helped to usher in the atomic age by offering an explanation for the energy contained within an atom. Science is not the only area to undergo a shift during this time. The world of art was changing as well. Beginning in 1850, realism began to emerge as the preferred method of painting. And this style focused on depicting everyday people and events such as farmers tending their fields or families gathered around a dinner table. This style was also marked by an attempt at photographic realism and a focus on nature. Two influential realists at this time were Gustave Courbet and Jean-François Millet. Courbet's paintings depicted subjects such as factory workers and everyday women. And according to Courbet, I have never seen either angels or goddesses, so I'm not interested in painting them. The quintessential statement of a realist. I want to paint things that are real, that I can see, that I can observe. Millet painted mostly rural scenes such as peasants harvesting their fields. His most famous work is what is depicted here, known as The Gleaners, and it's a depiction of three women working in a field. Now, during this time, the idea of materialism became dominant. Adherents to materialism believe that everything, even human thoughts and emotions, is the result of physical forces and properties. In other words, materialists believe that we are driven by outside influences that we have little to no control over, except through science. Friedrich Nietzsche, who lived from 1844 until 1900, was one of the most influential philosophers and materialists of this period. And he advocated the irrational, meaning that he believed that reason had little influence on human events. We couldn't think our way through things. We were just products of them. And so why obey laws to say, oh no, this will lead to this? So he's very much a nihilist, meaning that there is no reason to obey God's laws or to not sin because we're all just going to die and there's no afterlife. You do what you must now. And somewhat of an anarchist too, because he didn't believe the state should have the power to do these things. So rather, he insisted that humanity was at the mercy of irrational forces. He attacked Christianity. He blamed religion for destroying the human will. And for Nietzsche, both God and Christianity must be eliminated from society in order to progress. In fact, one of his more famous quotes was, "God is dead." And his idea would influence the attack against Christianity that we'll talk about next. Because in the areas of religion, as you saw with the Dreyfus affair in France, people are becoming very dispirited, disinterested in a hierarchical group telling them that you must obey the hierarchical authority and that you are nothing. So the growth of scientific knowledge led to this too. The more science we understood, the more God was taken out of the equation. Industrialization had consequences for religious life as well. Since a lot of people had migrated to cities in search of work, the bonds of small community churches were severed. The Christian church did not have such a strong hold on the urban workers. During this time, anti-clericalism, a movement that opposed the church, arose. And the new acceptance of Darwin's evolutionary theory led many Europeans to reject the idea of divine creation, and in some cases, the church altogether. In turn, the church attempted to suppress Darwin's ideas by simply not teaching them. If you look at Catholic schools at the time, they taught creationism and creationism alone and kept evolution out of it. In the United States, not necessarily just Catholic schools, but certainly a lot of Protestant faiths who controlled public school boards did the same thing. And hence you get to the Scopes monkey trial, for example, in the United States a little bit later. In addition, people began to apply scholarly criticism to the Bible. So the church responded by rejecting modern ideas and holding to the belief in a literal interpretation of the Bible, particularly in very Protestant sects, fundamentalist sects, who said, nope, the world was created in 7 days. All this evidence of dinosaur fossils, it's all misstated. It's a conspiracy. Another response was religious modernism. It's a religious movement that reinterpreted traditional Christianity by viewing the Bible as a book of useful stories about morality and not literal truths. In other words, the Bible says the world was created in 7 days by God. It may not have been 7 days. What's a day to an immortal being? The evidence shows a million years. Could be a million years. But the idea was God created the world. So some church leaders advocated compromise. For instance, Pope Leo XIII allowed Darwin's theory to be taught in Catholic schools as a scientific hypothesis, but not as absolute truth or dogma. So with the wealth of the Industrial Revolution burning in their pockets, the powerful nations of Europe were ready to formally expand their empires into Asia and Africa. And this is known as New Imperialism. And this desire for expansion was motivated by many things, not the least of which were the promise of economic growth, the sting of national rivalries, and a sense of moral superiority. Now, prior to the 19th century, Europe's interactions with Asia and Africa had mostly been limited to holding trading posts on the continent. Content to make money from these commercial outlets, Europe usually didn't impose direct rule onto these areas. However, as the 19th century progressed, a shift occurred. In this period of new imperialism, Europeans began to seek formal political control over foreign and overseas areas. And now that we have the definition down, let's take a look at the reasons for this change. And first, we'll hit the desire for economic growth. With the Industrial Revolution in full swing, Europe was looking to bolster their trade markets abroad. Think of it this way. In order to sell more goods, you need more places to sell them. So with this thinking in mind, the Europeans said to themselves, what better place than Africa and Asia? Along the same lines, colonies on these continents were seen as great places to get cheap raw materials for Europe's factories with a cheap labor force. Add to this that Europe needed a place to house and employ their surplus population, and you can see why new imperialism held the promise of economic growth. In fact, an excellent example of this were the Dutch, who sent almost 1 million people into Indonesia to work. And although many of these Europeans they sent either succumbed to disease or fled back to Europe, the Dutch influence can still be seen in Indonesia. Along with economic growth, Europeans were spurred on by national rivalry. And since land equaled power, the more land a country could acquire, the more prestige and power they could wield across the globe. Adding to this, no country wanted to see an empire they didn't trust gaining ground. And a great example of this were the British and Russian relations at the time. And this was known as the Great Game. I think of it almost as a spy Cold War epic, like during the United States and the Soviet Union in the mid 20th century. Russia and Britain became embroiled in a bloody battle for Central and South Asia that sometimes took on a military form, sometimes it was spies. It's all 19th century, very, like I said, Cold War-ish. So wanting to keep Russians from gaining power, Britain fought aggressively to keep them out of areas like Afghanistan, Iran, and especially India, which was the crown jewel of the empire. A lot of raw resources came from India. And this was also seen in the Treaty of Berlin, in which several European nations kept Russia from gaining ground in Turkey. And this leads us to the motivation of moral superiority. Not surprisingly, some proponents of new imperialism felt they had the moral right, if not responsibility, to rule over the heathen, uncivilized areas of Asia, and especially Africa. And this is plainly seen in the famous 19th century poem, The White Man's Burden, in which its author, Rudyard Kipling, whom you may be familiar with, he's also the author of The Jungle Book, calls the uncivilized, colonized people half devil and half child. Now, to those with this mindset, imperialism was seen as a way to enlighten and save the poor heathens from themselves. Obviously, they're children, they're not able to take care of themselves, and they're half devil, they haven't been introduced to civilization and Christianity. So with this attitude, it's easier to understand how the European powers felt little to no compunction when dividing up Africa, as seen in the Berlin Conference. Now, perhaps a bit along the same lines, European countries also sent missionaries to establish churches and schools in the conquered areas. And although there were definitely abuses done in the name of evangelism, this also aided the native inhabitants because some of the missionaries not only educated the people, but fought to end injustices such as slavery. So although the 1800s had seen most of Latin America gain independence, the area continued to struggle. Sadly, life for most of its people did not improve. Poverty continued, as did civil war. The wealthy continued to rule over the poor, and local dictators known as caudillos became the law of the land. And with these troubles brewing for decades, it's not difficult to see why the United States was able to step in and use their influence to gain power. A different kind of imperialism than what was being used in Europe, what we call Yankee imperialism. Now, this Yankee imperialism is not based on colonization the way it was for the people in Europe, in Asia and Africa. This is based more on economic imperialism, enforcing our economic control over people ruling themselves. So known to the world as Yankee imperialism, America's military and economic influence crept further into the Western Hemisphere. Now, first, as Latin America broke their old ties to places like Spain, the United States stepped in to fill the void. And matter of fact, in order to preserve independence and democracy, you may recall that our fifth president, James Monroe, issued the Monroe Doctrine that basically said that European powers are not allowed to meddle in the political affairs of the Western Hemisphere. That was the purview of the United States. So no longer receiving as many goods from Europe, Latin America's dependency on the United States did increase. And with this, the U.S. was able to set prices and control trade. Now, when Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, becomes president, he kind of extends the Monroe Doctrine somewhat with an addendum, what we call a corollary, the Roosevelt Corollary. You see, he wasn't content with merely trade. The U.S. had its sights set on much more. And with this, we do come to the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. Known for his desire to elevate the U.S. to a world power, Roosevelt was bent on lessening Europe's influence in the Western Hemisphere. And making this idea formal, like I said, he issued the 1904 Roosevelt Corollary. It's an addendum of sorts to the famous 1823 Monroe Doctrine, in which the U.S. basically proclaimed the Americas were no longer open to European colonization. And the Roosevelt Corollary took this a bit further. In true Roosevelt form, it aggressively declared that the U.S. held the right to intervene if Europe threatened to seize or control any republic in the Americas. In other words, keep your hands off our side of the world or you'll have to reckon with us. Now, although the Roosevelt Corollary may have looked like it was protecting Latin America, history has not judged its intentions so altruistically. In reality, it allowed for unchecked U.S. military intervention throughout Latin America. You may have heard the term Banana Republic. There's even a chain of stores named after that. Well, Banana Republic was one that was set up with the assistance of the U.S. military to put rulers in place who would be very friendly to U.S. economic interests, particularly sugar and fruit interests. So to many, the Corollary relegated Latin America and its people to nothing more than pawns in America's political game. And this was seen in the Platt Amendment, in which the U.S. forcibly took temporary control of Cuba after it tried to rebel against their elected government, who was friendly to the United States. Of course, many believe this elected government was pretty much just a puppet of the United States, with the U.S. pulling its strings. So a form of economic colonialism, some would say. So perhaps proving these rebels' case and making the U.S. look even more imperialistic, a few years later, the United States set up a permanent naval base at the famous Guantanamo Bay, which they forced Cuba to cede to the United States, and we still own it. So we have our own little military base on Cuba. Apologize for that little technical hiccup there. Now, the economic colonization or economic imperialism of Central America was really there. I mean, the term economic itself implies trade, and we wanted to make trade as easy as possible for the United States. So sights were also set on the creation of a Panama Canal. Now, prior to the creation of the Panama Canal, what you have is a situation where any ship that wants to get from the West Coast to the East Coast of the United States has only one of two options. It can go all the way around the world, or it can sail around South America. Why not make it much shorter? And so the shortest piece of land in between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean is what we call the Panama Isthmus. Why not dig a big ditch through the 98 miles of the Panama Isthmus and create a canal that ships can go through that will cut down shipping time by months and make trade easier? So wanting to make that trade as easy as possible, sights were set on the creation of a Panama Canal. Now, to do this, Roosevelt would have to get around the Colombians. Colombia actually owns the area that is today Panama. It's part of the nation of Colombia. And they ruled Panama and had no intentions of letting the U.S. build their precious canal. Now, not one to being told no lightly, the United States hatched a plan. Knowing of the Panamanians' desire for independence from Colombia, the U.S. decided to back the rebellion. And when the U.S. Navy began to descend on the area in support of the Panamanian rebels, the Colombians knew they were pretty much toast. They were no match. They backed down. Panama got its freedom. And what's the first thing this new Panamanian government, free Panamanian government, does? It leases the Panama Canal and the land thereof to the United States for like $1 a year for the next 100 years. And Roosevelt was clear to build his canal. Now, not only was his canal a go, the treaty forged with the new Republic of Panama declared that the area designated for the canal would actually be sovereign United States territory, which means we own it. It is part of the United States. What a deal. So following in Roosevelt's footsteps, President William Howard Taft picked up the imperialist mantle. However, unlike Roosevelt, Taft preferred to use economics over force. Known as dollar diplomacy, the U.S. realized it could indirectly control other nations by using economic means. And to be blunt, if they simply controlled the money and the resources, they could push Latin America around. An excellent example of this is the Taft administration's financial and military backing of Nicaraguan rebels. Of course, once the rebels were successful, the U.S. gladly stepped in, offering loans, making the new regime indebted to them, so that when the United States Fruit Company, for example, had labor problems in the country, the government didn't side with the laborers, it sided with the United States Fruit Company. So in excellent dollar diplomacy style, money was used to leverage power, in other words. And not only did dollar diplomacy benefit the U.S. Treasury and increase its power, it often did so without the mess of military action or the expense of setting up formal colonial rule. Not to mention, it's a clever way to quiet the anti-imperialist sentiment growing within the United States, because there's a difference between this dollar diplomacy imperialism and imperialism by force. In short, dollar diplomacy, like the Roosevelt Corollary, made it possible for the United States to have its cake and eat it too.